Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and today I want to talk to you about the 4 problematic types of overeating. I say problematic because overeating doesn't have to be this terrible thing. I think overeating becomes a problem when it's causing you to suffer. And this video came off the back of a conversation I was having with someone about what a binge was. We use this word binge and binging, binge eating, in a very kind of colloquial way. It's like there's a difference between clinical depression and how we might use the word depression in everyday language. So the clinical definition of a binge is to eat within a discrete period of time, usually less than 2 hours, an amount of food that is definitely larger than most people would in similar circumstances, and is accompanied with the sense that you have lost control, that you cannot stop eating. Now, I don't think we have to police language in a case of I don't want you to use the word binge eating unless it ties in with this clinical definition. I think we get to use whatever language makes sense to us in order to understand our experience and figure out what to do. That said, I sometimes wonder if it does us a disservice to always use the word binge eating when we're talking about this distressing sense of eating too much or being unable to change our eating behaviours. So the 4 types of problematic overeating, one of them is binge eating, sure. One of them is emotional eating. Then we have impulsive and compulsive eating. So if we were to start with emotional eating, I recently did a video about that. I'll link that above and below. Emotional eating is a very common experience that a lot of people can relate to. Food is designed in a way to make us feel good. That's what helps to drive us to eat. And sometimes people will say to me what they want. They want to get to a place where they only see food as fuel. Well, if you've had quite an emotional relationship with food, to just remove emotion from it, I don't know if that's realistic. And food is so tied in with how we feel physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, maybe even spiritually. So to look at food as just fuel, there probably are some people, everyone seems to know that one person who just thinks eating's a chore and they eat because they have to eat. But most of the people that I know enjoy food. There's a real pleasure element to that. So therefore, when it's something that we enjoy, our emotions are going to play into it. I think emotional eating becomes an issue when the very fact that you are emotionally eating causes more distress. So it might be that your emotional eating causes you shame, it causes you a lot of guilt, which on the whole seem to be worse than maybe the very feelings that you were trying to use food to cope with. So emotional can be tied in with binge eating. So people might be binge eating due to emotions. And sometimes people will be adamant that their binge eating is emotional and that it's nothing to do with restriction. And they'll say this because even though they've been quite restrictive, maybe physically or mentally around food, they can see an emotional trigger that comes before they binge. So therefore they blame the emotional trigger. But if you are fighting with food, if you're in a state of restriction and trying to control, that is a stress. It's a stress psychologically and it's a stress physically. So your pot is already nearly full. So then throw in an emotional event, you lose control, you binge, the emotional event gets blamed, and none of the restriction stuff that might have been going on before it gets considered. So if you think that your eating is emotional, do have a little check-in around restriction as well and see if that might be going on underneath that. And then next we have impulsive. Now impulsive is that idea of, see food, eat food. It's that situation perhaps where you're at work and somebody brings in a birthday cake, you weren't expecting it, you're presented with food, food is available, and you grab it without thinking. The word impulsive means to act without forethought. So if your eating is mostly impulsive, that one is probably not easy, but easier to get a handle on. It involves a little bit more forethought, a little bit more planning, making your decisions a bit more consciously. If you are going through your day having no idea what you're going to eat and when, you're much more likely to be going through your day making impulsive decisions based on what is available. And this may not be something that you've considered, but the lack of planning can increase impulsiveness around food. So what you might be thinking of as compulsive might just be an impulsive reaction to not knowing when food's going to come again. And thirdly, we have the compulsive eating. I used to use the word compulsive eating instead of binge eating because binge eating usually is a type of compulsive eating. But people seem to relate to this phrase much less than they do binge eating for some reason. And I think it's a good phrase because it's nothing to do with how much you eat. There are people who will tell me that they've had a binge and it isn't a huge amount of food, but the distress they're experiencing is often as high as someone who's having large binges. So the word compulsion means to feel as if you're acting against your own will. It doesn't feel like you're making a decision. It feels like the decision is being made for you and you're just being dragged along for the ride. I remember times where it would feel like my legs were taking me into the supermarket to binge. It felt like I had no choice whatsoever. But when I was reflecting and thinking about this video, I thought about actually there were certain binges where it felt like there was an element of choice and I chose to binge anyway. So this is where compulsion and binge eating might be a little bit separate. They're not always exactly the same thing. Compulsion seems to come from the lower part of the brain. It's like your prefrontal cortex is just shut down and you can't even think or make decisions. You're just on autopilot. And compulsive eating could be anything from a trauma response to a response to restriction. But for whatever reason, your lower brain is in panic. Your lower brain is taking over. So with these 4 different types, emotional, impulsive, compulsive, and binge eating, they can arrive in combination, or they can be a standalone as well. Something might just be impulsive, something might just be emotional, but sometimes it's emotional and it's a binge, or it's emotional and it's compulsive, or it's impulsive and it's a binge, or maybe it could even be all 4 of these things at once. But when we only use the word binge eating, we assume it's the same thing happening every time, that the reasons must be the same, that the solution must be the same, and by introducing these 4 different ways of thinking about it is an opportunity to understand what are the different situations, what are the different triggers. It's not always going to be the same thing for the majority of people. And if you're someone, for example, and your binging is mostly emotionally driven and not about restriction, thinking that the solution just lies in giving yourself permission might do you disservice, might cause more emotional eating. I believe that permission is important for everybody when it comes to food, but it might be that it needs to be paired with something else, with understanding what's going on for you emotionally, understanding what the things are that you are trying to avoid or cope with. And because of all these different factors, I think this is one of the reasons why there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to binge eating recovery. There are lots of different facets to binge eating and out-of-control eating, from the biological to the psychological to the emotional. And we're all so unique, and all of us are going to be influenced to different degrees by those things, which is why that idea of understanding what's going on for you in the lead up, how you understand this problem, how you understand why you have this problem, will be a big part of figuring out what are the areas that you need to focus on in order to recover. So you might find it helpful, if you haven't already, to check out this video about potential causes of binge eating. I hope this was interesting, and I will see you on the next video.